welcome everybody to this presentation on what it takes to deliver successful projects. My name's Stephen Dowling and I'll be obviously presenting tonight. Thanks a million for coming out, really appreciate it on a wet night like tonight, and hopefully we'll do our best to make it worth your while. Just a tiny bit about my background. You can probably tell from my accent I'm not a local. I blew in here from Ireland about 6 years ago, and I started off life as an accountant. Worked as an accountant for quite a few years when I left college, and then like probably a lot of us, I sort of fell into doing projects. I was working for a small office of a big news agency in Dublin, and I just fell into doing projects. And what I found at the time was, you know, it was just quite a bit different to my day job, and I found it was a lot more exciting and more dynamic. And I ended up staying in projects probably for the last 17 years. And then when we moved down to Australia, I wanted to try and find a new challenge. So I got into teaching project management and trying to arrest the growth of grey hair, working on big projects. Because I started off working on small projects and then graduated up to managing very big, large, complex, enterprise-wide projects. And from a qualifications point of view, I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, but I've got a lot of the normal badges out there for project management. I've got a diploma, I've got a globally recognized qualification called PMP, I'm a Prince 2 practitioner. So I've got a good cross-section of the things. And from a training point of view, I run short courses, and I also run credential courses for PMI Melbourne and Swinburne, and a couple of big clients I've got would be NAB, Department of Justice, and Wilson's Parking. So hopefully what I've tried to do with this short presentation is there's a couple of objectives that I want to get out of tonight, and everybody can be really honest with me at the end to see whether or not we've managed to do it. The first one is I want to really just go over with everybody what the differences are between operational activities, all the routine stuff we do, and project activities. Because to me, this is really important that people appreciate how these are different. The second one is I want to try and convince everybody of the importance of project management, because a lot of it is, you know, I came here to Australia and set up my business now, and I'm really passionate to believe that, you know, project management skills are really important. So hopefully I'll be able to convince everybody of that fact. And then obviously with the presentation that we're doing here, what I want people to walk away with is a good knowledge of what are those really important foundations to delivering successful projects. Because I believe there's, you know, there is certain, you know, if you want to run successful projects, whether it's small stuff or really big stuff, there's some very important foundations that you've got to put in place to give yourself the best chance of being successful. So that's really what I want to go through. The first thing I'd like to just ask is, around the room, or around the area here, hands up here, who would consider themselves to be project managers? Okay, so just a few, yeah. Okay, the first question, obviously, you know, when we talk about projects, is we've got to talk about, well, what is a project? And again, you know, hopefully we've got a small group here, so I want to try and make it as little bit as interactive as possible. So when we talk about a project, and to me, you've got to compare it with something else. So you think of a project versus some kind of operational activity. What's the thing, what makes a project different to an operational activity? Anybody, what are the things that would make it different? Because to me, you know, if we were trying to define it.
As a start and finish.
So as a start and a finish, yeah. Yeah, so that's a really, really important thing for projects. You know, when we talk about a project, it's got a start and a finish. So imagine if we were all working on a project team here. When the project finishes, everybody walks out the door, we turn the lights off, there's nothing there. So it has that definite start and a finish, yeah? Anything else, any other thing that you can think of that would be very different to a project? Budget, okay, so you've got to have a budget, yeah? Yeah. And what about the outcome that you're doing? Is it different? Have you done it before? No, sometimes not, yeah. There's a book that I'm going to refer to here. I'm not sure if anybody knows, and I know Rick here in front here would know this pretty well, but does anybody know what this book represents? Sorry? No, yeah, this is the best-selling book on Amazon when it comes to project management. It's called PMBOK, and it stands for Project Management Body of Knowledge. And this is the globally accepted best practice principles for managing projects. And I always make the joke that, you know, if you need something to help you sleep at night, I reckon you should buy a copy and put it right by your bed, because it's just like it's pretty detailed. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of really good stuff in here, and my passion is to try and simplify this and to try and work out, well, what are the things that people really need to know. Now, in this book, they have a beautiful little definition of what they consider to be projects. And their definition is a temporary endeavour undertaken to create a unique product, service or result. So this is their definition of what a project is. Yeah? Anything that falls in that definition, they would consider to be a project. Okay? And I add always a little bit extra. There's always at least a bit of a crisis. So whenever you're managing a project, you know, there's always some kind of drama, and that's just the nature of projects. You try and plan things, but there's always something that happens. Now, I want you to have a look at all of these different types of activities that we've got on the board here, and try to pick out for me what would not be a project. So all of these things, because to me, what I want to try and do is get a really clear picture of what projects are versus operations. So have a look here. Anybody pick out anything? Yep.
Process a new type of customer order.
Okay, so what would people think? Would we think that's a project or not a project? Okay, I would argue it depends on the definition maybe. So if you're just doing a brand new kind of order where you know it's a new customer but it's exactly the same process, couldn't agree more with you. But if there was a situation where you were doing a new type of order with a new type of discount which you'd never actually used before, then maybe we could argue that would be something that's different, that's new and unique, that hasn't been done before. But again, again, there's a bit of grey between how you can sort of, and that's the nature of some of the subject matter we're dealing with here. Yeah, Richard?
Manufacture existing products.
Yeah, so that's a beautiful one, isn't it? The very first time you would have done a project to manufacture the product, that was definitely something, you were doing something you hadn't done before. But now, once you've done it once, it's just business as usual, you're producing the same thing over and over again. Absolutely, yep. Anything else jump out at anybody there? Yep.
Complete your month-end account.
Yep, so again, that's another classic one, isn't it? If you were doing a project to implement a new financial system, then obviously completing your month-end accounts would be part of that project. But if it's just the normal routine stuff, absolutely, it's just a repetitive operational. Yeah. Anything else?
I'd say run a new marketing campaign.
Run a new marketing campaign, yeah.
To me, like that'd be something you'd be doing.
And this is where it gets a bit grey. You know, again, there's a little degree of uniqueness, you have it there, but you're right, if it's the same thing, your business is doing marketing campaigns, it moves very close to that operational side of things. So and again, this is one of those grey areas, yeah. The only other one that really might jump out at people is remake an existing type of cabinet. Yeah, so again, if you were a chippy or something like that, and the first time you make the cabinet, you have never done it before, but then again, it's just a repetitive operation. Now just have a look at a few of the other things here. Move house. Yeah, like to me, isn't that a project? When you look at it from a definition, take a family holiday to Europe. You know, they are projects. And the thing about it is, all of the principles that we talk about here can be related to any kind of project. It's not just all those really big things that you think of that, you know, from a company-wide point of view. They're projects. And this is where I really strongly believe that everybody around here should, if I ask that question, who's a project manager? To me, everybody's a project manager. I always use my wife as an example, and she has moved us across the globe a couple of times, and everything's gone like clockwork. And I say to her, like, you're a brilliant project manager. You know, she'd never ever done a course, but she's absolutely, everything went spot on. And so to me, everybody actually has project management experience. You just probably don't think of it in that context. Yeah, and you look at that definition, it ties in exactly to the definition that these boys and girls have put together. Yeah. Now, what I want to do is, let's talk through, because one of the things that I think is really important is to sort of just tease out a little bit about what's the difference between projects and operations. So when we look at, there's a number of characteristics I've got along the side here. And I want to just think through, and what's the difference between a project, and we can think about an example in your own mind, of a project activity versus an operation one, and just think about how they're different. So when we look at something like life cycle, and we take a project activity, and we think about, so when we look at a project activity, what's the difference from a life cycle perspective between project and an operational activity? So we saw in that definition. Temporary. So when you take a life cycle, it's got that start and a finish. Yeah? But when we look at an operations activity,
It's ongoing.
so it's ongoing. It has a start and a finish, but it's an ongoing type thing. Yeah? Okay? When we think about the outcome or the service or product that gets produced, and you look at a project versus an operation one.
Project can be a one-off.
Yeah, so one-off, it's unique or one-off, and this is where it gets a little bit grey, the degrees of uniqueness, but it's unique or one-off, whereas when you think of an operational thing that gets produced, what's the characteristic of it? Is it unique or once-off? It's repetitive, isn't it? It's the exact same one. It's the same thing that's repeated. Now let's just think about the resources, the people or resources that are used to do a project. How would those resources be different between a project activity that you're doing versus an operational one? So when we do a project activity, from a resource point of view, how's it different? What are we, when we're trying to do any kind of,
Ad hoc.
sorry?
Is it ad hoc?
Ad hoc, yes.
Set of people,
Yeah.
diverse amount of people?
Yeah, so of course, depending on the project you're doing, you're going to have to work out what kind of skill set that you need. Yeah, and again, it depends if you're implementing a new payroll system or something like that, or a new, like my background is enterprise systems, you'd have to have that full cross-functional group that would be involved. Yeah. Would everybody agree that when you're putting the project together, it's going to be specific for the project? So you're, whatever project you're trying to do, you've got to sit down and you've got to think back and you've got to say, well, okay, what do I need to do this? What resources do I need? And there may be specialists that I need. It may be that cross-functional resource, but it's going to be specific for the project that you're doing. Yeah. Whereas when we think about an operational activity, when you think of the resources that are used for it, you've got a normal, operational, engine. So if you take any person here now, we're working in industry, and you're doing an operational activity. You'll have people there in your organization that have got a job description, they've got a roles and responsibility, and it's just business as usual. They just do the normal run-of-the-mill stuff. Whereas when you look at a project, a lot of the times you're doing something ad hoc, you haven't done it before. So again, it's not always clear who should be doing what. So from a roles and responsibilities point of view, it's quite different when you look at those two different things. And very similar when we look at costs. It's the exact same story, isn't it? You're going to have to work out from a budget point of view, how much your project's going to cost. Whereas, when you look at it from an operational point of view, you just have that normal operational budgets that are established. So again, quite a bit different when you look at it. This is always interesting. When you compare a project activity that you're going to do to an operational one, and you think about the risks or the uncertainties with respect to the activity, how would a project be different, do we think, to an operational one?
High risk, lots of unknowns.
Lots of unknowns, isn't it? Yeah, and again, I suppose what I would argue is when you're doing a project, and again, it depends on the project that you're doing. If you're implementing a new thing which is really big, you've never done it before, absolutely, the uncertainty that you're potentially introducing is very big. If you're doing something small, it may not be that big, but by its nature, you're bringing something new in. Yeah. Whereas when you look at an operational activity, is that happening?
It's known risks.
Should be known, and a lot of the time existing. And senior or management in any organisation may decide to run a certain level of risk because there's obviously a risk-reward relationship. Yeah. And again, you've got existing ones. And then the last one is when we think about it from an organizational change point of view, and this is, changing something within your organization that you're doing. How is a project different to operations? When you do a project, is it going to bring change or is it not going to bring change? it's going to bring some kind of change, isn't it? And that's the nature of projects. You're changing something. Whereas if you look at an operational one, are you changing anything? Not really, not normally, yeah. So again, no significant change. Now this is a beautiful one in a way. I don't know about anybody else, but when you take this little one of change, like, do people typically like to change? Not really. It's like, I don't know, but everybody's experience is different to mine, but a lot of the time people don't want to change. And there's a great quote by Machiavelli. He once said that there's nothing more difficult or more perilous to try and bring a new order of things. So this one is a big one. Now, what I like to do, and we've just done this for a second, when you actually compare these activities side by side, how different are they?
They're almost opposite of each other.
Aren't they? Aren't they? They're very, like, they are, like, chalk and cheese is the thing that comes to mind, isn't it? They are so different. Now, this is the thing that I do in any of my training courses, is I make sure that people really get a full understanding of how different these things are. They're very different. And so if you want to be successful to manage a project activity, it's not going to be the same as running a normal operational activity, because the characteristics are very different. And this is one of the things I try to make sure that people really appreciate straight off the bat. You've got to be really aware that if you're running this thing like a project, it's very different to an operational one. So we've got to be careful. That's why we should do it in a certain way to give ourselves the best point of success. And what you know, the second question I always like asking here is, what happens if you stuff up the activity? So if you stuff up an operational activity or manufacturing a product and instead of red it comes out green, what do you have to do? Sorry?
Just make another one.
You got to make another one. You got to fix it. You've no choice. But what happens when you're doing a project and you're 2 months into it and then suddenly you sit around, scratch your head and you think, oh, let's start again. How easy is it typically to do that? Very difficult, and a lot of times it's maybe even impossible sometimes to do it. So what I like to say to people is, my view of projects are like trains. That, you know, it's once a train starts moving from the station and it starts gathering momentum, it's very hard and very difficult to pull it back. And especially as you get into managing bigger and more complicated projects, the faster that train goes, it is very difficult and messy to try and pull it back. So to me, this is one of the things that, you know, from a project point of view, why, you know, planning is such a key activity that we need to go through. Is, you know, while that train is sitting in the station, you got to really spend quality time to think this stuff through before it starts moving. Because once this baby starts moving, a lot of times it's very difficult and messy to try and pull it back. Yeah. Now, I just want to talk through something. This is something, it's a very personal thing in a way, because this is the thing that has got me to basically set up my business here, here in Australia. And I've basically, you know, committed myself to setting up this company, ETM Management Training, to teach it. And I'll just walk you through just a lot of the thought process that I've gone here. When you take a typical manager in an organization, and that manager can be working in any of these particular functions, any of them, finance, sales, IT, you know, marketing. And you think of what this person does day to day. So on a lot of the times they're doing a lot of those repetitive type tasks, aren't they? And these are those, you know, operational, all the same, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, whatever. When you look at, and you think of, you know, think of any of your jobs, if any of us are working, I would always argue, or I'll argue, that any typical manager in an organization is also doing those new and unique type activities. And these are the start to finish, which is the project-based work. Now again, anybody feel free to challenge me on this, but when you look at what people are doing in the world today, I believe every manager in an organization are doing both of these types of work. Would anybody challenge me, or anybody?
Can I give you a minor challenge?
Sorry? Yeah.
A minor challenge.
Sure, please, yeah.
When you get into tasks that are yearly, and
Yep.
That can be a stock take.
Yep.
And all of a sudden you have to actually draw in extra resources to actually
Yeah.
achieve that end.
Yeah.
It turns into a project.
Yeah.
So even though it's a regular task and it's done
Yeah.
manually, it becomes a monumental thing because it's
Yeah.
so big that it's...
Yeah, and you need to pull in those resources to get through that, so it's got
but
that
it's
time bound,
repetitive
and it's,
efficient.
yeah, and you're right, and there is these ones that fall in the gap and in this grey area in the middle in terms of what they are, absolutely, yeah. And then isn't it true as well that there's always, you know, when you do project work, there's always that, you know, if you're doing, like in my background, system implementation or something like that, you'd have a project work, and then there's obviously a key component where you transition that project work into the operational side of things and get it all part of the operations. And to me, that's always an important part, last step that you do in your thing. So it migrates from the project work into the business as usual. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask, so if we both agree, or we all agree that everybody's doing both of these types of work, and again, I know this is a very arbitrary split, but you know, just think of the typical manager in an organization, he or she, what they're doing. What would we guess? You know, when you think of what the work that they're doing today, what would the percentages be, do we think? Would it be 50-50? Would it be 80-20, 60-40? And I know it could vary greatly across different organizations, but just kind of some kind of a feel. What do we think? 80-20 in terms of operational? Yeah, anybody different?
I'd probably say that some people just prefer to actually focus on the project work and not focus as much on their business as usual.
Because it's more interesting, or
absolutely, because it's
yeah,
new and unique.
yeah. And you're right, it is a lot more buzz, you know, and that's where I came from. You know, you're doing the same repetitive, it's boring, let's get on to the more exciting stuff. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I suppose one of the things I was doing, you know, when you look at that split today, and then you go back, say, 10 years, what would we think? Do you think, would it have changed in terms of, say we pick 80-20 as an arbitrary number, and you go back 10 years, would you say it's the same balance in terms of what project work is and operational work, or do you think it would be different? More project work now, yeah. And why do we think? Why would anybody have a guess of why? IT
for a start.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Competition. Yeah. I was doing a big project in Europe, and the project was to put in place a thing called a project office here in Asia. And I was doing some research in a book, and this quote jumped off the page at me, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And basically these guys are saying changes in the environment, changes in customers' expectations, changes in technology used in organization have brought many organizations to the point where they argue up to 80% of what people are doing are project work rather than repeat process work. Now we can obviously argue greatly with that, but to me, like we've all agreed, there's a big percentage work that people are doing of projects. Now we've just looked at the difference between operations and projects. They're very different, aren't they? You know, and again, this was the thing that really got me to set up my business, because I was looking at, and I was managing really big and complicated projects, and I was thinking to myself, well, hang on a second here, the principles are not that difficult, and really everybody needs to know them. And one of the things that I passionately believe is that there's, you know, when we look at this, and I'm going to refer to it in a minute, you know, people heard of Pareto's law, 80-20 rule. And, you know, like if you look at a company, typically, you know, 80% of their revenue comes from 20% of their clients. And this is where I strongly believe that when we look at this whole thing called PMBOK, which is all the best practice principles of managing project, if you actually take 20% of this, I believe it provides 80% of the value. And I think everybody in the world today needs to know this 20%, because we're all doing projects and they are very different to operational thing. And just for us all to be competent, I think, you know, it's skills that need to be done. Now, and again, you know, when we think about it and just think about our own worlds that people are coming from here, you know, when we talk about experience of projects, what's the general feel? And I always use this in any of my training courses. I try to gauge what's the pain out there when it comes to running projects, you know, success and failure. You know, have people, maybe you've lived a charmed life and you've, you know, had a really good time, but what is there, from a pain point of view, what's the feeling around the room here, you know, in terms of projects?
Late and over budget, i.e. Mikey.
Yeah, high and mighty. Yeah, yeah. And it's, but you just have to pick up the paper any day, don't you? And the same. And I suppose where I'm going with this is like, I think a lot of the time, like, you know, a lot of it when you actually boil it down can be traced back to some of the principles not being applied properly. I really do believe it, you know, and I think a lot of people, especially when they get into project management, they get lost in the detail. And one of the things I really strongly believe is you've got to understand the really important basics. And if you get the basics right, I really believe a lot of the rest of the stuff, you know, takes care of itself. You know, when you think, you know, one of the things when you look at the impacts of poorly managed projects, and I'm sure we've all experienced them, what would be the big ones that would hit people? Like, you know, if we've been exposed to projects that have gone wrong, what are the big things? What would... Resources wasted, yeah, isn't it? The amount of time and effort that I've seen it so much, you know, like that people who work all these hours get stressed and, you know, work weekends and stuff like that, and a lot of it can be for nothing. Yeah, anything else? What are the other big implications? Yeah.
Some projects will have experience with, in fact, it never worked, and because the planning was wrong.
Yeah.
So an example at the moment is the TAFEs.
Yeah.
So what the TAFEs, and I think some of the universities have tried to do is consolidate
Yeah.
all their reporting into one system.
Yeah.
And they've assumed that every TAFE is similar to the next TAFE.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw it a while ago.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
got a $20 million
Yeah.
blowout.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
the project itself
Yeah.
was maybe too ambitious.
Yeah. And yeah, and we're going to hit on that in a second now, because to me, we're going to talk about what are those pillars for success. And you're absolutely right. Planning is such a key one to make sure you think stuff through before you do it. And I bet you, like you say, I'd agree totally. A lot of that, I'm sure, can be traced back to people not thinking about stuff and really planning and scoping it out properly. But if you don't mind, hold the fire in a second, we'll touch on that in a second. What are the other big implications? Like, just think of the implications, the impacts of, so wasted resources. Reputation could be huge. You might never recover. If you're trying to do a project for a big client, big and important client, and it goes wrong, you could be stuffed, absolutely stuffed, yeah?
Staff leaving.
Staff leaving. I've so many times you'd see people, they just get worn out, and they just get fed up with the thing, and the amount of, you know, expertise and knowledge that just walks out the door, absolutely, yep. What are the big ones I've got here? You know, reputation, cost blowouts, you know, missing important deadlines. You know, if you've got a really important drop-dead date and you miss it, it can be catastrophic. A lot of times people don't realize opportunities. If you're too busy trying to sort out problems that you have, that there could be a really great opportunity that just turns up on the doorstep, and because you're too busy trying to sort out the mess from the previous one, you can't take advantage of it. You know, and again, morale and motivation. And, you know, in a lot of the papers, when you look at them, they focus on the cost. But when you actually look at all of the costs and you actually try and factor, it's just mind-boggling, you know, the actual true cost. So, and again, like I was saying, you know, when you look at any project, a lot of the time, I really strongly believe that when you get to the root cause of a lot of the things, it can be traced back to a lot of the basics. So let's just talk about those basics. And to me, you know, when you talk about trying to set yourself up for success, to me there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is I don't believe those foundation stones are too difficult for people to know and to grasp. The bad news is that you can never guarantee success in a project, because a lot of the times there's going to be things that are outside of your control. So there's market conditions change, there's people that don't want to change, there's people that are not going to listen to you. So a lot of the times if I'm operating as a project manager, all I'm aware that what I can do is to put foundation stones in place to give myself the best chance of being successful, and then if things go outside of that, I'm raising my hand and I'm letting people know. And that's all I can do as a project manager. You can never guarantee success on a project, in my view. So let's just think about it, and we say, okay, what to me are the really, really important pillars for setting yourself up for success? And what I'm going to focus on, like I was saying before, is this Pareto's law. We want to focus on the most important 20%. So over my years of working as a project manager and it's the last 2 years in training, I've really worked hard for me to try and distill down what I believe is the top 20%. So when we look at the pillars for project success, to me the 4 key pillars of success are, and as we've mentioned here, planning. And I'm going to look at each of these in detail in a second. So planning is key. The second one is that we've got to use a suitable framework or a methodology we call, which is a way of doing projects. So, you have to use something that makes sense for the project that you're doing. Now, it doesn't need to be big and complicated, but it's just a step-by-step way of actually doing the project. The other 2 ones is whenever we're doing a project, we have to have the right organization structure set up to be able to support the project. Now, we're doing something that's new and unique, you haven't done before, so you don't have that operational organization structure. So to me, as a project manager, what I'm doing is I'm going to come in and I'm going to put that organization structure around the project to be able to give it a chance of success. So when we'll talk about this, the team, the project manager, somebody who takes ownership, the sponsor, and whatever else is needed. And you've got to put that suitable structure in place. And then the last one is the project manager. A lot of people don't appreciate, but the role of a project manager is key. And when Pinbook, here they have the project manager is a VIP. He or she who's managing the project is a very, very important person. And they are the person who has this full, or they should have this full visibility of the whole project. So they're the linchpin that should have that full integrated view of what's going on. And I suppose when you look at all of those 4 pillars and you get the right project manager, a lot of the other stuff is going to follow. So having the right person who knows what they are doing is absolutely key to success. And to me, they're the 4 key pillars. If you put those 4 pillars in place, I strongly believe, that you're going to set yourself up for success. Now, we'll talk about each of them in detail now in a second. Yeah, sorry, you have a question?
Your previous slide there, Stephen, that was a brilliant slide with the iceberg.
Yeah.
Because when I do project management, we put change management at the same level as project management. And what brings a lot of projects unstuck is what you don't see.
Yeah.
And that's why the iceberg analogy
Yeah.
Works very well, because you plan for what you can see.
Yeah.
What brings you unstuck
Yeah.
is what you don't see.
Yeah, and I suppose it comes back to planning. Like we say, so planning, if you actually do proper planning, you want to get down to the devil's always in the detail. So let's just tease out, and I suppose what I would like to do is think for yourselves now. Think if you have experience of a project, just put yourself in the hat of thinking about that project that's gone wrong, and just as we talk through each of these pillars, try to think for yourself, well, why did it go wrong? Why was it so bad? And to me, then just trying to see, well, okay, was it one of these things that maybe was caused? And I'll be really interested in what people think at the end. So let's just tease through each of these and talk through them. So like, to me, planning, and I think it was Benjamin Franklin first coined the phrase, fail to plan, plan to fail. That is everything for projects. You gotta, as a project manager, I insist that we spend quality time planning, and everybody's going to put pressure on you. We've got to get moving. We've got to make it happen, and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't spend that time planning, then you're just setting yourself up for failure. And to me, when you look at it, and especially when you get into bigger and more complicated stuff, planning, the actual effort of planning can take up to 40% of the whole project life cycle to be able to do it. Very important, and you've got to just sit down and spend that quality time planning. And if you don't, just think of that train. The minute that baby starts moving, it's very difficult and messy to pull it back. And if you haven't thought it through, you can get yourself into lots of trouble. Now, the question always comes out to me is, well, how much time should I spend planning? And the thing about it is, it depends. And when you look at it here, you say, well, the amount of time I spend planning is going to be a function of how big is the project, how complex is it, and how much risk or uncertainty am I dealing with? And if you've got something where there's very big, very complex, lots of uncertainty, then doesn't it make a lot of sense that you would spend quite a lot of time planning? Now, if you're doing something that's, again, Mickey Mouse small, then, you know, from a planning point of view, it doesn't make sense that you're going to spend lots of time planning. So, you know, you're not going to have a huge, big sledgehammer to crack a small nut. So, you know, and I suppose in the world today, one of the caveats I would say is when you're dealing with those bigger or more complex programs, you can end up spinning your wheels. And because there's, you know, a lot of the times you can't actually think everything through because it's just so complicated. So what you do is there comes a point where you just say, we've got to move forward. And then by moving forward, then things become clearer. And they have a thing in PMBOK called rolling wave planning. And sometimes you just got to go, it's like waves at the beach. You plan the first wave, and then while you're doing the first wave, you're planning the second wave. And sometimes that's just the nature of stuff, you've got to do that. And there's another great quote by, you know, the famous general from the Second World War, George W. Patton. He said, you know, a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. So you can never have that perfect plan. I suppose it comes with experience when you sort of know you've just got to go forward. Okay, any questions on planning? This was a quote I came across as well, which made me laugh. There's a famous guy over in the UK, Sir John Harvey Jones, and he said that, you know, planning is a natural process, much more fun to do something. And the nice thing about net planning is that failure comes as a complete surprise rather than being preceded by a period of worry and depression. Because when you think about, you know, why do people, you know, not spend the time planning? Because it is boring, isn't it? A lot of the time you're there, you want to get moving, you know, and by moving and you start getting into it, you know, everybody looks at you and you're getting things done and it looks like you're really moving forward. But if you haven't actually thought things through, it's amazing how you can have, you know, you're going up the wrong alley and then you've got to backtrack, yeah? So again, it made me find it humorous. That second pillar is all about this thing called, you know, method. You know, and what we've got to do is you've got to have a suitable method for the project that you're doing. I don't know, have people heard of a thing called waterfall? Would anybody have heard of a term called waterfall? Yeah? So a lot of, when we look at PMBOK, PMBOK is based on what they call waterfall. And if you imagine a waterfall, you know, just all the water's coming here, and then it's going down the waterfall. Well, the principle behind a waterfall methodology is that before you go down the waterfall, you've got to work out exactly what it is that we're doing. So what is the scope of all of the work that we're doing? And it's only once you actually nail down with the customer, the client, what it is that we're doing, then can you actually move forward down the waterfall. Now, in the world today, a lot of times, you know, this, you know, I don't know if people have heard of Agile. You know, there's sometimes in the world today, things change very fast, or sometimes the customer doesn't know what they want. And in that kind of a situation, you can't really sometimes use that methodology, which is the waterfall one. You've got to break it into smaller chunks to be able to deliver things. Now, most of the time, when we look at most of the projects that we all typically deal with, they all really follow a waterfall type structure. So when we look at this globally accepted principles, they follow a waterfall methodology. So when we look at methodology and we say, okay, if you wanted to follow best practice principles to manage any project according to what these guys say, then their whole approach is that you've got to do a number of stages when you go through a project. And the first stage that they say is you must do this thing called initiate. So this is basically just kicking the project off. And what they're talking about is you've got to stand back and you've got to look at the project and be very comfortable that you've got three things with regard to this project. Is you want to be clear about what it is you're doing. You want to make sure that you've got a sound reason for what you're doing. And the third thing that they say is you've got to have somebody who's going to take ownership for this project. So somebody who takes that accountability and ownership. And they say that it's only once you've done those three things can you actually move forward into the next stage, which they have is planning. And there's, you know, when you look at PMBOK, there's a big proportion of this that is based on planning. And they go through all these best practice processes and what's the correct flow that you should do when you're actually going through a planning exercise. And then once you go through planning, they say then you should do, once you've gone through planning, you actually go and do the execution. I did a short course at the Department of Justice, and they didn't like that word execution. They said, can we change it? So, and when you think about execution, and you know, as a project manager, there's always two things that should go hand in hand with execution. One is you should always be monitoring what's going on. And anybody have a guess? How do you monitor anything? What's monitoring about? Measuring. So, and when you measure, what would you be measuring? What would you be comparing?
Actual against
Yeah,
forecast.
that's all it is just plan. So if we've done all your planning here, all monitoring is just looking at plan versus actual and if there's a variance. And then as a good project manager, you should be always, you know, doing some control action. So if you've got variances, you know, and it could be anything, you know, cost, schedule, budget, quality, anything, communications, then what you're doing is you're doing these control actions. So all along the journey of getting the project done, you should always be doing those monitoring and control functions along the whole journey of getting the thing done. And then what PMBOK would say is we then would go to the end of the project, and because it comes to a finite end, you've got to close it down, you've got to finish it. And what they say is, you know, to make sure that you know that you've come to each of these ends of the project, they would have what they call these deliverables, so which signifies you get to the end. So PMBOK would say that before you can move into planning, you should have this thing called a charter, a signed off charter. And they would say that you would get burned at the stake if you move forward into planning unless you've got this thing like an approved charter. And in PMBOK speak is this is the thing that gives it life. This is the thing that gives your project life. And the principle behind it is that, you know, they say that you should stand back before you start diving into doing lots of planning. You should be asking those 3 questions right at the start. You know, am I clear about what we're getting ourselves in for? Have I got commitment? You know, is there clarity on what it is we're doing? And is there a sound justification for why I'm doing it? And doesn't it make sense that you ask those questions before you start jumping in to doing lots of planning? And it's amazing how many times people don't do that. And then they get into the planning, and then suddenly you realize, well, hang on a second, we're not really committed to this. Like, do we? So that's the whole principle. So it's just make sure you ask those questions before you dive into the detail of planning. And then in PMBOK, you know, we talk about this thing called a project management plan. And as a project manager, this is your Bible. This is the thing that you're going to be living and breathing with your project. So you're going to work really hard in this planning stage to work out this project management plan. And then this is the thing that's going to measure you at the end. So again, the same kind of idea. You'll be burned at the stake if you start into execution without getting your plan approved. Because one of the things that people don't really appreciate is best practice principles say that you shouldn't, as a project manager, you shouldn't take ownership for everything. You should basically get somebody to say, well, here's my plan, you approve it, and then once you approve it, you know, then I'll go forward and I'll actually then take responsibility to do the plan. But if you take on a project and you don't get that approval, then you take all the ownership. And best practice principles would say, no, that's the best practice principle is you get somebody to approve the plan and then you take responsibility to deliver that outcome. And then anybody have a guess? What's the thing that would signify you get to the end of the project, where you know you've actually come to the end of the project and that's it, you've actually done it? What would be the thing that would signify that you'd come to the end? Anybody have a guess?
Sort of sign off.
So you get the product or sign off, isn't it? And who's typically will be signing it off?
Usually the customer.
The customer, the client, isn't it? So getting those deliverables approved or customer sign off. And you know, as a project manager, you know, this is what you're all about. When you're doing a project, you're trying to get to this day, and the minute you get this customer approval, it's such a happy day. You know, the big smile breaks out, and I don't know about what happens in Australia, but in Ireland we go straight to the pub, and everybody gets all these several pints of Guinness, and the temptation then is to say, well, it's all over. But again, best practice principles would say, no, you need to go through this final step of closing the project. And basically, in a nutshell, all close is about is just tidying up all those loose ends. Just making sure that you get all of those bits and pieces that are left over, archiving documentation, financials, all of those kind of things that you have. You've had this engine that's been going. You know, there may be contracts there. You've got to go through and make sure that everything is being discharged and everything you do there. So it's tidying up all those loose ends. And then the final thing that you're doing is there's a big focus on continuous improvement. So you should always be making sure that you look back over how things have gone from the start of the project all the way through the execution phase, planning, execution, and thinking about what's gone well and what's gone badly. And any of those things that have gone well, you want to make sure you do them again. Those things that have gone badly, you want to just make sure you get better. And the whole idea is if you actually do that well, then, you know, when you go through this cycle a couple of times, you're going to get really good at what you do. And, you know, a typical thing that you would use to finish off the life cycle is just get a completion report, something that sort of tidies up and finishes off. Now, when you look at that, that's not rocket science, is it? You know, and if you want to follow, this is basically what this whole PMBOK is saying. If you want to follow best practice principles to manage any project, this is the stages that you should go through. Now, obviously, it depends on the project you're doing, how much detail, and like we saw that, you know, graph of how much planning that you do depending on size and complexity, but the principles are all the same. And you know, and like it's amazing, like when I've managed really big things, exactly, it comes back to this, but obviously the level of detail that we go down to is going to vary greatly. And the thing that, you know, when we look at, you know, the difference between projects and operations, the importance of following that step-by-step process can't be overstated. Because this is the whole, it's like that big train. If you don't spend that time planning and you jump straight into execution, how often do you get yourself into some kind of a mess? But it's not, it really isn't rocket science, is it? You know, when you think, you know, just think of any of the projects you're doing and you think, well, okay, it's the importance of following this step-by-step process. Any questions on that? Any?
Sort of business I'm involved in, we call it design, build, and operate.
Yeah.
And in point of fact, we try and get the client to outsource the operation to us.
Yeah.
So come to close, it's not really a close because we continue involvement.
Yeah, and what I would say to everybody here, like everybody around the room here, we're all involved in different types of projects. So, and the challenge is that, and I say this to all of the participants that come through my short courses, is those principles I guarantee you apply. But what you've got to do is you've got to fit them around the types of projects that you're doing. And, you know, like the example here, that type of project you're doing, you know, you take the principles and you say, okay, how does that fit around the types of projects that I'm doing? And this is what you've got to be able to do. We say, okay, here's best practice principles. Now, how does it look like for me? If I want to apply those, I got to, you know, sometimes, like you say, from a close point of view, that close step, what does that mean for me? How does it mean? Yeah.
So that circular part, and we revisit that a lot. So that continual improvement
Yeah.
process. So it's interesting you've got there step diagram.
Yeah.
We call that a whirlpool diagram.
Yeah.
In terms of a revisiting as a continuous process
Yeah.
to improve the project.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, within, like, you know, in PMBOK there's a big chapter on quality. And the essence of quality is two things. One is, you know, for us to get the approval from the customer, the client, one of the really important things is you've got to make sure that the quality of what it is that you're going to do meets their expectation. So when it comes to getting sign-off, we've got to make sure that we have quality right. Otherwise, we're going to potentially have a big problem. And then the other big part is continuous improvement. And they say that, you know, it's just the life we live in projects, nothing's ever perfect. You've got to always have that hat on to try and think about it. Yeah? And again, that's the essence of it. That's, if you want to manage any project and you want to follow best practice principles, these are the stages that we should go through to complete it. Now, the other thing which I'll just run through is, you know, within within this PMBOK, they have a thing called knowledge areas. And within the knowledge areas, there's certain key areas that when it comes to managing a project, there's some important things that we've got to always take account of. And this, if you imagine this is a 9-pane window, I use this in my course to help people to measure it or to remember. And I have, so the first area is scope. And when we come to, do you remember when I was talking about the foundation or the waterfall concept here? A lot of the the whole waterfall concept is working out what are we going to do before you go down the waterfall. And that's why I've got the symbol here of the rock. The rock basically signifies the foundation stone of the whole project. So when you're in planning, the very first thing you've got to be clear about is what are we doing? And you've got to really get total clarity on what it is that I'm doing. And then once you know what that is, then you can move forward into working out, well, what resources do I need? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? And this is where a lot of projects go wrong right at the beginning, is because they don't have clarity on the scope of what they're doing. And I'm sure we've heard the word scope creep. And that is just, it's like if you talk to any seasoned project manager, when you hear scope creep, you think of this like, what I think about is like the Ebola virus. It's like a nasty thing that if it starts, it just grows, and before you know it, it takes over. And it's one of these things that is just, when you look at a lot of those big projects that go off the rails, a lot of it comes back to this. It really does. You gotta nail the scope. You gotta really work it out well before you start doing anything else. Yeah. And then the other knowledge areas is obviously time is a huge part of what you do in a project. And they have a big saying in PMBOK, time is of the essence. And it sounds like a watch commercial, isn't it? But it's basically, if you can do things quicker, they say that there's a big link with uncertainty and risk. So if you could do things in a shorter time period, there's less risk, there's less uncertainty, there's less chance that resources are going to be pulled out. Money will be taken away, things will change, the environmental will change. So there's a big push in PMBOK to make sure you do everything as efficiently as possible. So when we look at time, it's all about building a really efficient schedule to do things. Obviously, cost is a big part of it. We've got to work out a budget, how much it's going to cost, and work out how much things are going to cost. And then obviously when we get into execution, you monitor and control it. I've talked about quality, that big link with quality, and work out, well, the scope, this is what we're going to do, but you got to get the customer to agree and to sign off. You got to make sure the quality is in line as well, because if you don't, potentially they're not going to sign off, and then you've got all kinds of problems, don't you? That could be the biggest train smash you'll ever have, is if the customer doesn't sign off at the end of the project, and basically the whole thing could go down the toilet. Yeah. HR, and again, that's working out all the human resources you need for the project. So there's a lot of important things about planning it and then going out, acquiring, developing, managing the resources. What else? Communications. Have a guess. As a project manager, how much time do you reckon you'd spend communicating? Lots. Out of 100%.
60, 70%.
Yeah, you're spending even 90%. It's a huge part of what you do. And it's cited as probably the second biggest reason projects crash and burn is when you've got a breakdown in communications. Hugely important. Risk. Again, risk is all about uncertainty. And as a project manager, what your job is to try and manage uncertainty. And you're all about trying to identify what uncertainty you're dealing with. And then when you're in planning, we call it the negotiating stage. Up until you get your plan signed off, you can actually negotiate to try and reduce down uncertainty. And it's all about trying to bash it down to a nice acceptable level so that you can have it, that's something that you can manage going forward. So risk and managing risk. And then two other areas, procurement. You got to work out, obviously, a lot of times projects, you got to go and get things. You work out what you got to get and how you're going to get it. So procurement's a big part of what you're doing. And the last one, which is left in the middle intentionally, is a thing called integration. And when you think about what you do as a project manager, your number one job is to be the integrator, the one who glues it all together. And I know in the real world today, a lot of us, we get involved in doing things. But if you want to look at your job as a project manager, your job as a project manager is to be the integrator, the one who pulls it all together, the glue that sort of sits there. And that's why in PMBOK they say you're a very important person, because you're the only one that probably has the full integrated view of everything. So you're the one who should have that full integrated visibility of everything that's going on. Other people will have a little bit of the components of it, but they won't have that full view. So you're the one, and I know in the real world you get involved in doing stuff, but if you're doing stuff and you're not actually integrating, then you're not doing your job as a project manager. You should be, first and foremost, you should be doing that job as the integrator. So they're just all of those methodologies, and you know, when you try and summarize it about why should I use a methodology, and this guy over in the States did a big survey, and he found out that there was people who didn't have a methodology and they ran projects and they were successful, but then there was those people who had a methodology, and he found out in this big sample that he did that if you had a methodology, it doubled your chances of success. So it's all about, as things get bigger and more complicated, you just got to have a step-by-step way of doing things. And if you have that step-by-step way, there's less chance you're going to forget things and you're going to miss things. And it doesn't need to be big and complicated. It just needs to be a methodical way of going about what you're doing. The third pillar is organization structure. So this is all about working out, well, okay, what organization structure do you need to support the project? And when you look at it, I don't know, would people be familiar with the term project sponsor? Would that be it, Tom? And what best practice principles would say is that you should always, if you want to set your project up for success, what you should always have is you should have one person who takes ultimate ownership and accountability for your project. So this is somebody who's just in the organization. It's they take that ownership. And you know, as a project manager, it's very important that you have that person that you have a good relationship with, because what you want to have is somebody within the organization who's got that ownership. And just imagine if you don't have somebody who really owns it, then as a project manager, a lot of the times you don't have that responsibility, or you don't have that authority or status within an organization. And if you don't have that, then a lot of times things can just fall into a hole. So they say that you should have that. Yep. Champion, yeah. Yeah, so that's the same word, project, a champion, or that, yep. And again, when you look at it, so, you know, again, depending on the project you're doing, a lot of the times you might need to have a bigger, you know, like in my background, when you're doing a big enterprise-wide type project, one of the things that you've got to do is you've got to sit back and think about, well, okay, for us to be successful, what kind of people do we need to have to support us? And what you'll do is you'll work with the sponsor to pull a good team together and have a steering committee with all of these people signed up to support the project. And if you don't have that, a lot of times, if there's problems in any of the areas, you can just fall into a hole. And then, you know, you just look at, you know, the team. You know, you've got to have the right people, don't you, in a project team. If you don't have the right people, then, you know, where are you as a project manager? I'll talk about the project manager in a second. And then, you know, when you look at that organization structure, you've got to make sure you have the, you have obviously the customer, the client is who you're doing it for. And then, you know, there's all those other stakeholders that need to be involved, and making sure that you've got the right people there. And you know, just making sure you've got that whole framework that supports you. Because if you don't have all of those people identified and the right people in the right cog, then, you know, it's going to be extremely difficult for what you're doing. And when you think about project manager, and we don't have time to do it tonight, but you know, when you actually sit down and think about what does it take to be a good project manager, and you know, if you were the person who was trying to recruit a project manager for your business, and you were trying to run a really life and death project that if it goes wrong, it could be catastrophic, your reputation is damaged, and you think about what kind of skill sets you need, it's actually quite amazing. Like I just did, and I do this in my class, I think about, well, what would the ideal project manager look like? And, you know, to me, these are a lot of the skills that you would be looking for from a really good project manager. And you look at it, you know, there's a lot of a mix of lots of different things. You know, and as a project manager, a lot of times you've got to wear a different hat at different times. And it's a tough job. When you start, you know, managing bigger and more complicated projects, you definitely need to have, you know, somebody who has a good mix of skills, and none of us have everything. So, you know, obviously you surround yourself with a team and have people that complement you. So nobody is Superman or Superwoman. But, you know, a lot of times people don't always appreciate, you know, what it takes to be a good project manager, because you're really that jack of all trades. you know, and I put this up as an image, you know, when you think about why is it so important to get the right project manager in the job? You know, when you think of that definition, you're in this pressure cooker with the start and a finish. And the thing is, if you don't get the right project manager in the job, you know, very quickly, like I just sometimes use an example, like when I'm using and you're running a big project, when it comes to execution, you've got all the team together, you could be burning lots of money every week. And you know, you've got all these people working on the project, and if you've got a problem, and problems happen, you know, you might have a week to solve the problem, and then if you can't solve the problem, things can very quickly escalate. And that, to me, that's another really, one of the really important reasons for having the right person in that role. If you have the right person there, he or she, you give yourself a fighting chance. Whereas if you don't, things can very quickly spiral out of control. Now, and again, we've sort of gone through, it's gone, you know, I've rattled through this, but I really strongly believe that, you know, if you get these 4 pillars right, then I really believe you set yourself up for success. And like I said at the beginning, a lot of times you can't guarantee success in a project. All you can do is put the foundations in place to give yourself the best chance of being successful. And then the minute things go outside of that, you've got to be prepared and willing to put your hand up and let people know, you know, what's happened, because things are going to have to change. Now that's, yes, we've, you know, to me that's, and again, we've gone through this pretty quickly, but, you know, that's a lot of effort that I've gone into over the years and trying to distill things down into things. So I'm not sure if there's any questions that anybody has. They want to, more than happy to try and answer anything that people have.
The one, your cost, quality, or time, the favourite is you can choose only 2.
Yeah, you're right. You can, one of the things that people don't realize on a project is there's a thing called, what we're referring to as the theory of constraints. You can't have everything. You know, and you think of, if you drew a triangle of, you know, they used to, in Pinbook, they had a thing called the iron triangle. And they have, you know, basically all these constraints. So you have scope here, you have time here, and you have dollars. And like we talk here, a lot of times when you go into people and say, well, what do you want? I want everything. And I want it for this cost, and I want it by this time. And when you look at constraints, that's not the way it works. You know, if you pull one of these constraints, it affects the other. And that's just the nature of it. You can't have everything. You can only have those 2. So like we said there, it's so true. Yeah. Anything else? One of the things which before, sorry, yes, apologies.
What's the difference between Pinbook and Prince?
They're very similar in methodologies. Like Pinbook, well, Pinbook actually, the big difference, Pinbook, I'm sorry, I don't have a slide that explains this. Pinbook isn't really a methodology. What it is it's best practice project processes. And then what they say is, which the reason I like it the most, is they're very flexible. They say it's up to you to know your own business. And then you basically pick what processes make sense for you. And then you build it into your own methodology, your own way of doing the project. Whereas Prince 2, what they do is they give you, if this was a Prince 2 manual, they say, and you want to follow Prince 2, you got to follow the manual. And it's a lot more prescriptive, and the terminology is different. But again, it's a waterfall-based methodology, so it follows the same principles, but but it's very prescriptive. It just basically gives you the whole shooting match. And to me, in the world today, that's just not the way it works. You know, you're always under pressure to do things. You're not given the luxury of being able to do all these things and take this, because time is money, and, you know, doing all this stuff. So you've got to be flexible. And to me, that's why I like Pinbook the most, because they say it's up to you to pick what makes sense, what are the processes that are relevant for me, and then I'll build that into my own methodology around those different stages that we went through. And that's what it, you know, you're about. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Richard?
There's a lot of medium or small, medium-sized organisations. You might get an ad hoc request to a CFO we're about to buy another business.
Mm.
Give me all the facts. The owner says, give me all the facts and figures about that.
Yeah.
You might have a service organisation that says, we're going to take on the service and support of this new product set.
Yeah.
Go and tell me what it's all about.
Mm.
You might have a marketing person says we're about to go into another relationship with a new manufacturer,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to resell their products.
Yeah.
Work out whether it's all going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Under your description, they are ad hoc projects,
Yep.
new, not regular.
Yep.
And you won't get a project manager for that.
Yeah.
Because it's a small enterprise.
Yep.
The CFO's going to do it, the marketing guy's going to do it,
Yep.
and the service manager's going to do it.
Yep.
How do they step up to the plate, or what do they do in those environments to get the project,
Yeah.
which is identify that it is good to go ahead,
Ye-
buy new business,
Yeah.
service new products, bring a new manufacturer online
Yeah.
to sell?
Yeah.
How do they step up to the plate?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to all of a sudden become
Yeah.
PIMBOK experts or anything.
No, and there's quite a few elements in what you're doing there. It's like, a lot of the time, do you do things? And there's a business case that needs to be put together to think about, well, okay, what are the costs and the benefits of what it is we're doing? So there's a decision-making process. Really, when we looked at what we were doing, we're taking the project and we're trying to do the project from start to finish. So, I suppose like that, where you don't have the project manager, like to me, the principles still apply. And it's just following that step-by-step way of doing it, isn't it? Like that, that example, well, let's, are we going to go ahead with this? You need to work out, well, is there a justification? Are we, let's work out, that's step one, isn't it, before you do it? And then, okay, you say, okay, yeah, we're going to go forward with it. Then it's how you define the project. What is that project that you're going to define? Our project could be the definition of getting that business case together. That could be the project. So a lot of it comes down to how you define the project is that you're going to do. And you're right, in a lot of times you are doing the work, you are the project manager. And I suppose, so where I come from, and I've developed a short course where I believe, and again, you can challenge me on this, if people know those principles, then to me, no matter what project you're doing, you've got to step back and say, well, okay, now I know what the principles are. Now here's the project I'm doing here. This is how I can scope it and I can get a clear view of what it is I'm doing. Now how does that apply? And then I try to apply that to the type of project I'm doing. And then if I'm doing the work as well as managing it, then you're right, that's just the world. You've got to do that. But one of the things I've seen that where things go very wrong is that people try and part-time doing this, and as you get into bigger and more complex projects, this is a full-time job. A full-time job integrating, making sure everybody's on the same page, and people who don't see the value that a project manager brings, they sort of see, well, they don't see a lot of output. And they're thinking, well, he's got a plan done. Now, what's he doing here with the execution? I'm being charged this. But it's all those things that you're doing around the edges to managing all of the people and making sure everybody stays on the same page is so hugely valuable. And if you take your foot off that and you just do the work, then things can very quickly get out of control. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question well enough, but yeah.
It's a difficult environment because you find, I've seen CFOs and service managers,
Yeah.
they disappear.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the day-to-day ops go out the door.
Yeah.
And go
Yeah.
outside, what are
And
they doing?
yeah, and
And
yeah.
they're on a project, but they need to pull in resources from,
And yeah.
but they don't necessarily know how to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
According to the way you think.
Yeah, and a lot of it, when you come back to it, if you actually scope these things properly, what happens is you surface all of the work that needs to be done very quickly. And a lot of the time, if you don't scope it, you don't identify all of this work that needs to be done to do it properly. And then it just, then you sort of bumble through it. But the whole logic of what we're saying is you've got to spend time thinking about, well, okay, if I want to do this properly, what's all the work that's needed? And then it very quickly jumps out of people saying, crikey, I need resource to be able to do this. If you want me to do this properly, I need X resource or whatever to be able to do it. And a lot of times people don't do that, so it doesn't surface until it's too late and you're in the middle of trying to do it. Yeah. Okay.
That's a risk thing, though.
Sorry?
I'd say that's a risk.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes back to,
That issue there.
sorry?
That issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry?
We hear a lot about milestones. At what stage do you set those? At what stage of the planning? Is it the planning stage or the initial negotiation?
Yeah, well, during the planning stage, when we talk about, the natural flow that you'd go through, what you do is first of all, you work out all of the work that needs to be done. And once you work out that work and you get a clear view of the work, then you go, it makes sense then to work out, well, okay, here's the work. What resources do I need? And then if I've got these resources, how long is it going to take me? And then what you'll do is once you'll follow that sort of flow, and then you'll work out milestones linked to what we call all these deliverables that you're going to have in the project. So you should always have a one-to-one link with a deliverable and a milestone. And it's all about putting that stake in the ground. But you've got to, there's a natural flow that you do. You work out what work I'm going to do, and then once you know the work I'm going to do, then you've got to understand how things are linked together, understand the resources I have, how long things are going to take, and then the milestones will come out of that exercise of working out that information.